Let's see. Mhm. Welcome, welcome everyone. We're just waiting for a few more minutes for more participants to join us, and then we will start. Okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Olga Radionenko. I am the Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you today for our webinar entitled China in the Middle East Crisis, Balancing Power and Interests. We're very grateful to our moderator, Associate Professor Hongyang Zhang, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We're specialized in the field of energy economics, and we provide a forum of exchange of ideas and expertise among professionals interested in the field. To find out more about the association, please visit our website, iee.org. A few housekeeping matters with regard to today's webinar. The webinar is recorded and will be posted on YouTube and on our website after the webinar. If you have any questions, please click on the chat button in your Zoom window and type your question. The moderator will read the questions during the time allocated for the Q&A. And now I would like to introduce to you our moderator, Associate Professor Hongyang Zhang, who is also IEE's Asia-Oceania affiliate leader and who works at the China University of Petroleum, East China. Professor Zhang, over to you.
Thank you, Olga, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Hong Yan from China University of Petroleum, and I will be your moderator today. We are meeting at a time when the Middle East is once again facing intense volatility, and global powers are recalibrating their positions. Among them, China's role has drawn increasing attention not only as a major energy importer, but also as a significant diplomatic actor. So to help us unpack China's evolving role and its navigation through complex power dynamics, we have three distinguished experts with us today. First, welcome Dr. Philip Andrews Bede, Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Philip has spent over 40 years in the field of energy and resources with extensive industry experience and academic expertise. And welcome Dr. Mikhail Meydan, Head of China Energy Research, also at Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Mikhail is a leading expert in Chinese energy policy and geopolitics. And also welcome Dr. Hu Bin, Director of Global Climate Governance Research of Tsinghua University. He focuses on China's foreign policy and climate governance and has been invited to many international climate dialogues. So we will first enjoy the sharing from our speakers and then begin the Q&A session. I'm sure we are in for a great discussion. And I will turn over to our first speaker, Philip.
Hello, everybody. Good to be with you. The crisis that we're in takes me back when I was a young man. I just got my driving license, and the oil price had gone from $6 to $30 a barrel. There were speed limits of 50 miles an hour in the UK. You couldn't get petrol in most of the petrol stations, and the factories were working a 3-day week. Life isn't that bad yet, but maybe it will get there. Before I start talking about China, I'm just going to share with you a very brief snippet on where we are or where we think we are with the Strait of Hormuz crisis today. We're in the 10th week of near closure of the Strait of Hormuz. With oil supply, we probably lost 10 million barrels a day or more, which is about 10% of global consumption. And with LNG, we probably lost about 20% of global LNG supply. And there's no end in sight, despite the rhetoric from the USA. On China's side, it's dependent on imports of oil for about 80% of its use, and about half of this comes from the Middle East. And LNG provides about 20% of the country's consumption of natural gas, and about 30% comes from the Middle East. So this is important for China as it is for many other countries. My role in this discussion is to set a historical context, focusing on China's long-term obsession with energy security. And we see three phases under Mao's leadership and beyond, in the early 2000s and since 2019. And in each case, there were slightly different reasons for this obsession with energy security. So if we start with the period 1949, maybe to the late 80s, early 90s, but certainly in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, China was isolated from the rest of the world, especially after its break with the Soviet Union in 1960. It developed a sort of drive for self-reliance in everything. Particularly energy was vital for industrialization. So they focused on fossil fuels, developed the Daqing and Shengli oil fields and the Shanxi coal, and really coal from wherever you could find it. And then really from the mid-1990s, early 1990s, mid-1990s, opening up, that whole period changed the way that China saw energy in a way. They realized that self-reliance in many fuels was not possible, it was not necessary, and it was not cost-effective. Oil production was failing to meet targets, so the country becomes a net importer of oil. And it was also set to become an importer of natural gas. So this period lasted almost a decade until we got to 2003. This is the second phase of obsession with energy security, because the lights were going out all over China. And why? Because there'd been a sudden surge of economic growth. GDP was rising at greater than 10% a year. And in 1998, during the Asian crisis, when the economy slowed down, the government had actually stopped the construction of new power stations. So when the economy picked up rapidly, there wasn't enough electricity. So from 2003 onwards, there was a policy of just more of everything, particularly with respect to electricity. We saw the renewable energy law, which introduced a feed-in tariff for solar power, and then in 2009 for wind power. In nuclear power, we saw a rapid increase in number of construction starts. And we saw a surge in coal production and the construction of coal-fired power stations. In parallel, there was a huge push for energy efficiency in industries. And this was successful. So the domestic crisis with electricity was solved for a while. Meanwhile, imports were growing, particularly of oil and gas coming through pipelines, and also LNG through import terminals. And then you get into the 2010s, and there was a sort of interlude. Everything relaxed. There was a greater focus on climate change and reducing air pollution, ever-increasing renewable installation, steady increase of nuclear power, and a peaking, can you believe, temporary, of coal and oil production and consumption in the mid-2010s. But from 2019 onwards, we saw a resurgence of this drive for energy security. There were two catalysts. One was external, that was tensions with the US from 2019. The second was domestic, which is the power outages in the summers of 2021 and 2022. So let's start with the external one, because that is actually more relevant to what we're talking about today. In 2019, Xi Jinping called for more oil and gas exploration and development. There was a 7-year action plan for oil and gas production, 2019 to 2025, and various tax incentives. To my surprise, I'm a geologist. I worked in China 30 odd years ago as an oil geologist. This was actually successful, startlingly successful for oil. Onshore, they were exploring for more unconventional and very deep oil and production using very advanced enhanced oil recovery techniques. Offshore, we saw CNOOC doing more exploration and production in Bohai and in the deep water South China Sea. As a result, oil production, having declined, has been picking up at about 2% per year. Modest production increases onshore, but really quite significant increases offshore that continue today. Natural gas, it had been growing anyway, particularly with the push to unconventional gas, and that production has been increasing at about 6% per year. So domestic fossil fuel oil and gas production has been growing. Also acceleration in building oil and gas stocks. Now, numbers for this are difficult to get, but people think there's about 1.2 billion barrels of oil stocks, maybe more. And this is about 3 months of oil imports for China, which is what the International Energy Agency has for its members. Gas, maybe 20 billion cubic meters of natural gas storage, which is 2 to 3 months of LNG imports. So let's go to the domestic side, the electricity problem. What has happened since 2021? Basically increasing coal production, building more coal-fired power stations, acceleration, if that is possible even to think of renewable energy investment. Last year, 120 gigawatts of wind was installed and maybe 370 gigawatts of solar power. These are enormous numbers. Nuclear reactor starts have been increasing between 21 and 2025. 37 reactors have started construction, which is an average of 7.5 reactors a year. This is a huge amount of nuclear power coming online. And there's been a surge of investment in the grid. So the electricity sector looks as if it's going to get very strong. So all of this in the oil and gas and in the electricity and in coal has been putting China in a very strong position to withstand energy shocks. And I will stop there and move on to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Philip, for giving us very comprehensive perspectives and inspiration and helping me understand the historical context for China's energy security. So let's turn over to our second speaker, Macau.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers and to my distinguished fellow panelists. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'll sort of pick up, I guess, where Philip left off and maybe sort of on some of his points in a little bit more detail. Sort of when we look and when you hear the commentary on China and the Gulf crisis, there's sort of the commentary often tends to be, at least in the press, a little bit binary. It's sort of China wins or China loses. China's, uniquely exposed to the Gulf, or China is uniquely strong. If we go to the next slide, the reality is that it's a little bit of it's both at the same time. In terms of oil imports, roughly 50% of China's oil imports, so close to 6 million barrels a day, come from the Middle East. Not all of that transits through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is a little bit less. It's maybe 4 million barrels a day. which is, for a country that imports around 11 million barrels a day, it's a massive chunk to lose or to potentially lose. Iran of that is sort of 8 to 10% of total imports. So Iran alone is probably replaceable. It is really the Gulf supplies that are a bigger shock. So a massive crude footprint, but when you flip it, you could also argue, and if you look at the right-hand chart, it's pretty interesting how the Middle East has been capped at around 50% of China's total imports. So 50% dependence on the Middle East also suggests 50% not from the Middle East. And in times of crisis, there are alternatives. They won't necessarily make up for all of the shortfall, but there are other supply sources. If you look at other Asian countries, Japan, for instance, the dependence on the Middle East is for almost 90% of its crude, so a much bigger exposure. And when you factor in the availability of domestic supplies that Philip just talked about, then actually to feed the refineries, the share of Middle Eastern crude is slightly lower, and there's a bit of a buffer there. If you go to the next slide, it's not just about oil, it's also oil products and predominantly petrochemical feedstocks, so LPG and naphtha. China imports 40 and 45% of its LPG and naphtha respectively from the Middle East. After it sort of stopped buying or reduced its purchases of LPG from the US because of tariffs and the trade war, it's shifted to rely more heavily on the Gulf. And so again, 45%, 40% of petrochemical feedstocks is a really big share. Again, you can flip that and say, well, China has domestic production and a massive domestic refining industry that precisely in the 1990s, when it became a crude oil importer, there was also a decision to build up domestic refining capabilities so that the country would be dependent on crude but not on products. And so in the bigger scheme of things, then the Gulf accounts for 10% of naphtha, 20% of LPG, not negligible, but there are sort of workarounds on petrochemicals. But the story doesn't stop with petrochemicals. And if we move to the next slide, then there's also exposure to LNG. Qatar accounted for 27% of China's LNG imports last year. If you throw in the UAE, that's close to 30%. So again, a big number for LNG, but flip it and look at the availability of domestic gas production, pipeline imports, then overall it's 6% of China's total gas demand in 2025. Interestingly, this year, sort of the country came into the winter well supplied in terms of stocks. It was a relatively mild winter. Demand has been weak in the first quarter. It's sort of been flat in the first quarter. But China's been able to displace that LNG to actually resell LNG cargoes and to supply the domestic market with a combination of domestic supplies, pipeline imports, and some switching away from LNG to coal. So there is that, again, this big exposure, and these are big volumes that transit through the Strait of Hormuz, but decades of policies have really helped create buffers. If we go to the next slide, I think those sort of various efforts to diversify supply sources, both domestic, international, diversify fuels, build out a bigger energy system, have really vindicated sort of that energy strategy has been vindicated. Around 84% of China's supplies are domestically produced, of total energy supplies are domestically produced. And here you can see a chart from CNPC, ETRI, from CNPC's think tank, from their forecast, that it doesn't have today's numbers, but 84% is today, and the ambition is to increase to get to 95% of domestic supplies. The power sector, more specifically, as Philip was just describing, has actually achieved a much higher level of self-sufficiency. So the lights won't go out in China because of the outages in the Middle East. Gas is a very small share of the power sector. Oil is virtually inexistent in the power sector. So unlike Southeast Asian countries that rely on oil for power generation, or Europe that has, or the US that rely on gas for maybe 1/4 of their energy mix and for a greater share of power generation, that's not a problem for China. And that whole sort of focus on energy self-sufficiency is going to remain and even increase in terms of policymakers' thinking. That said, things are overall okay and manageable. It does depend on how long the outages will persist. There are price impacts. And if we go to the next slide, because the implications, I think there are ripple effects through various markets. So it's the oil products, the LNG. So there's not sort of no impact, right? And so there are a number of provinces that are more exposed. A number of provinces are the big consumers of gas and power, like Guangdong, Zhejiang, Beijing has a lot of gas and power, where the supply shortages, the price implications will be a factor. Chemicals is sort of suffering a double whammy from both the petrochemical feedstocks and the gas that is used as heat. And here you can see sort of just China's gas demand by sector. And there are ripple effects. The shortage of diesel globally is impacting mining activities in countries like Australia and Indonesia, which produce iron ore and coal that is then imported into China. It's impacting mining of nickel, of copper, of other commodities that are used in the production of new energy supply chains and other inputs. So there are sort of ripple effects, of course, food systems, sulfur, that don't impact perhaps they don't create supply outages in China, but they increase costs. And we're seeing a lot of Asian countries now suffering with food supplies, helium and other things that go into chip making. All of these things have a combined impact, and they will impact the global economy. They're already impacting the global economy, inflationary expectations, the outlook for global growth. And as the Chinese economy does rely on exports for a big part of its economic outlook, that will have implications for the Chinese economy and for Chinese energy demand. So China is not insulated. Again, it's worked hard to create significant shock absorbers, but it's not insulated from the impacts of the current crisis. If we go to the next slide, the 15 five-year plan was published in early March, around the time of the crisis. Obviously, it was drafted and conceived well before the crisis began. But I think a lot of what is happening right now will resonate and will sort of only feed into the existing thinking. And again, building on decades of energy security policies, that electrification has to continue. I mean, China is already the leader in terms of the share of electricity in end uses, and it has surged rapidly, and that will continue. Clean tech manufacturing is a massive part of China's both economic growth, of its energy system, as Philip was talking about the deployment of renewables in China, but it is also a big export industry, and a source now of soft power. Sort of we're seeing that on one hand, a lot of Asian countries that are struggling with fuel supplies, with oil products. Part of that is also because China has restricted exports of oil products to make sure that the domestic market is supplied. So it is now offering products to sort of friendly countries and neighbors and helping out regional economies, but also saying, look, I mean, renewables offer energy security. We're able to supply them. Let's increase exports of renewables. I think there's an interesting question that we can go into in the Q&A about sort of involution, about this notion of, well, overcapacity industries. So the refining sector, chemicals, a lot of the clean tech space, there is a lot of capacity and this involution, right? This competitive price pressure because of that competition. So on one hand, the rising input costs, the weaker demand could actually help tackle some of those involution pressures. On the other hand, I think there's a question of to what extent will local governments want to make sure that economic activity is sustained, that supply security is sustained, and therefore on balance, we're not going to really resolve involution in the near term. But that also means that exports remain a very important outlet for Chinese clean tech producers. If we go to the next slide, this sort of resonates with a debate that is, I think, happening right now in the world, which is, is this going to accelerate the energy transition? The war in the Middle East is clearly highlighting the volatility and risks of fossil fuels and, assumptions that the Strait of Hormuz would remain open even in a crisis. All of those assumptions have been tested. Moreover, we are in the second crisis, or at least in the second very big gas crisis, but a second global crisis in 4 years. And if you add on COVID, then, a third energy supply demand crisis in a while. So renewables do offer a very positive pathway towards greater energy security. Is it going to accelerate? I think, again, there's a lot of arguments for why, yes, renewable adoption is going to accelerate. I think there are also concerns that governments will be worried with protecting consumers, with rebuilding stockpiles of oil and gas when they have them, with cost inflations that will come from the current environment. There is a big debate in Europe about the political acceptability or risk perceptions and risks associated with dependence on Chinese clean tech. So I think all of that is playing out, and it will be interesting to watch. I think on balance, it will accelerate the energy transition and demand for Chinese clean tech. And of course, it's not just exports of Chinese clean tech. We're seeing very interesting moves sort of towards greater investments overseas, investments in manufacturing, in third countries, and sort of EPC contracts. And I think that will only continue. If we go to the next slide, that's also part of China's story in the Middle East, which I think is interesting. We look at China as a buyer of commodities from the region, but it's also increasingly a very big investor in solar, hydrogen, again, in a lot of these clean tech technologies. There are new forms of collaboration with Saudi and the UAE of investments in Central Asia. So the footprint, China's footprint in the Gulf, is actually much deeper and broader than, what looking at the oil and gas picture tells us. There's also sort of telecoms and other investments, but a really big sort of exposure to the Gulf. So if we go to the next slide and sort of, well, what does all this mean? If we think about, China's attitude to the region, and again, I sort of using maybe a little bit of a false dichotomy of a winner and loser, I think it is a very mixed bag and a very complicated situation. There's no sort of clear cut. There's wins and losses even sort of within China. As I was just saying, China is a buyer of energy commodities, but also a large investor in the Middle East. And there's a question of how do you protect people and assets in the region? There was obviously the example of Libya over a decade ago when workers were airlifted out of Libya, but that created a problematic precedent that was hotly debated even within China about sort of how do you mitigate risk? How do you better calibrate your exposure to geopolitical risk? And I think we're only going to see more and more of those debates occurring now following this latest crisis. Again, there's a lot of commentary about, well, it's actually good for China if the US is bogged down in the Middle East. It will be pulled away from the Asia Pacific. That sort of rhetorically, China is very, and not just rhetorically, China is able to point to the fact that it is a stable actor in the international system, whereas the US is reckless. But I would argue that the upending of the global international order is not something that's good for China. China has benefited from the multilateral world that we live in, and it's sort of unraveling, and the chaos is bad for everyone. Now then there's a question of sort of will China step in geopolitically or to mediate the crisis? And we saw the Iranian foreign minister in China just yesterday. I mean, I still think that on balance, China remains reluctant to step in more actively. I think itself sort of talks about perhaps limited leverage over Iran and even more limited leverage over the US. But we will see if Iran will come up in the Trump-Xi meeting next week, and whether there will be an expectation for China to step in a bit more. I think the preference to date is sort of this active neutrality and to support other middle powers like Pakistan to lead. But we will sort of see, I think the longer the delays, the longer the disruption, then the more these buffers that China has built will be tested. And obviously China will want to be part of the reconstruction, both the physical reconstruction of a post-war and the kind of reordering of the global energy system, the global multilateral system. But that's all still very far away. And I think where we are today, it's this balance of power, interests, but rather a messy mix of vulnerabilities and assets. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Macau, for sharing us a very detailed data support. And also you have raised some interesting questions. We can talk through them in the Q&A session. So let's turn over to Dr. Hu.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon and good night, colleagues and online audiences. So thank you for Professor Zhang's invitation. Actually, I just want to respond to like Michael's just point. China is reluctant to be the leader for the in the Middle East crisis. I think China is also the same in the climate negotiations. Like because last year in COP30 in Brazil, lots of countries expect China to play more roles in climate negotiations, but China uh, actually don't intervene too much. But from my experience, like because when I just landed in Belém in Brazil, the first car I called taxi is BYD. So although China is reluctant to admit its role in climate governance, but it really makes something happen in practice. So I think that's just China's style. So because I just heard of your like about the China's role in Middle East, so I just want to say something about China's climate. So okay, now go back to my today's topic. So I want to talk about this from three aspects. So the first one I want to say is I think the Iran crisis means something different. Now I think the traditional concept is energy security. I think now should be to a broader concept of transitional security. Energy security risks ask, can we secure enough energy today? But transitional security asks a larger question. Can we secure energy, industry, supply chains, and climate goals at the same time, while moving from the old energy system to the new one? So I think this is a new challenge for China, also for the world. Because we think now the clean energy transition should not be seen as a luxury for the stable times. I think it is also part of the solution to instability. If a country depends heavily on imported oil and gas, every crisis in a producing region on shipping route becomes a domestic risk. But if more transport is electrified, if more industry use clean electricity, if more buildings are powered by low carbon energy, and if power systems become more flexible and resilient, then the external fossil shocks lose some of their powers. I think China this time actually did very good. I can give you example in Beijing, because now Beijing like the EV cars penetration rate is really high. So this time, because each time when the fuel price increase, the petroleum China will send me a message to say, okay, the price will go to higher tonight. So please go to the petrol station. But when I go to the petrol station this time, actually that they don't have a long line this time for the Chinese fuel cars, because which means most family now have an EV car. Like me, I have two cars, one EV car, so I don't need to drive my fuel cars. So that's one phenomenon. That's why China did very good. Also, I think also the Michael and Philip also mentioned some other reasons, like we diversify a lot. We also, for example, we import a lot of like oil and gas from Russia, right? Without geopolitical risk. So I think yeah, China really did good time this time. I think also China actually prepared this long time ago, like 10 years ago. China central government is beginning to prepare this kind of like energy shock after the I think the war like 2014. So after that, China's government begin to prepare for the energy security, facing more geopolitical risks ahead. So the key message here is energy security is not a reason to delay the transition. I think it is a reason to govern the transition better. I think for this direction, I think I have the same opinions. I think with Michael, I think the Middle East crisis will accelerate the transitions in the long term. So that gives the second point. So China will accelerate the transformation in the long term, but also secure the bottom line in the short term. China's energy strategy after the crisis can be summarized, I think, in just one sentence: secure the energy bottom while accelerating structural transformations. So this is not a strategy of abrupt fossil exit, nor it is a strategy of returning to fossil dependence. It is a mixed and portfolio strategy. So in short term, China must protect energy supply security. So this means diversified imports, strategic reserves. I think this plays another important role for this time, like strategic reserves. Domestic production capacity, stable electricity supply, grid reliability, and the managed role for coal and gas. So two of you also mentioned the coal use in China. As we know from 2020 to 2024, actually China's coal use increased in those 4 years. Actually, I wrote a paper published last year in Foreign Affairs. The main reason is the demand for electrification is very high in those years. So the installed renewables will not match the increase of demand for electricity. Because the capacity doesn't mean generation, right? Although the installed capacity increased a lot for renewables, but due to the storage issues, due to the transmission issues, they didn't catch the increase of electrification. So that's why the coal still increased in those 4 years. But we also need to notify another aspect. The electrification rate of building and the transportation sectors also increased a lot in those 4 years, which actually is very good for the midterm and long term. As long as in the future, the renewable energy becomes more proportional in the whole energy mix. So if we have a high rate of electrification, then these sectors will be easily decarbonized in the long term. So that's my argument in the article published last year in the Foreign Policy. So the second point I want to make is the China's strategy is the transition is moving from simple energy transition to broader carbon management after Middle East crisis. So renewables and electrification are essential. They are the backbone of the future energy system. But they can't solve every problem, as we know, right? Steel, cement, chemicals, aviation, shipping, and parts of the power sectors are difficult to decarbonize through renewable substitution alone. So some emissions are not just from fuel combustion. They are embedded in industrial policies. So cement is the best example, right? So this means that if China wants to decarbonize without this industrialization, it needs a wider technological portfolios. So that portfolio includes renewables, electrification, storage, circular economy, low carbon material, digital management, carbon accounting, and also in some selected sectors, CCUS. This another key point I want to make. CCUS, of course, shouldn't be treated as the center of the whole transition. Also, it shouldn't replace renewables for sure, efficiency or electrification, but it is an important tool for sectors where emissions are hardest to avoid. It can help the manage emissions from existing industrial assets, support the low carbon transformation of coal power and heavy industry, and also provide a practical bridge for sectors such as steel, cement, and chemicals. China now already had more than 120 CCUS projects under planning, constructs, operation, covering electricity, oil and gas, chemicals, steel, and cement. So although these figures comparing China's emissions are small, but they show the direction of the CCUS is moving from pilot projects toward industrial applications. So more importantly, I think it is becoming part of a broader carbon management system that links technology, regulation, finance, markets, and industrial upgrading. So in this sense, decarbonization becomes a new layer of infrastructure. I think also you mentioned 15 years plan. I think in this 15 years plan, China combines climate policy with industrial policy. I think it's very also making the infrastructure as a backbone for climate policies and also for economic growth. So we often think of infrastructure as like roads, ports, railways, power plants, and grids, but the low carbon transition requires another infrastructure systems like CO2 pipelines, storage hubs, industrial clusters, carbon accounting platforms, low carbon product standards, and the carbon markets, green financial channels. So this infrastructure is less vivid than wind turbines and or solar panels, but I think it is the steel skeleton beneath the transition. For example, in the world of carbon border just measures product carbon footprints, green procurement, and low carbon supply chains, the ability to produce low carbon steel, cement, chemicals, fuels will increasingly shape trade and investment. So that's why in China's newest 15 years plan, the industrial policy is closely connected with climate policies. So China's climate interest and industrial interest are therefore convergent. Decarbonization is not only about reducing emissions, but also preparing Chinese industry for the next phase of global markets. So lastly, I want to talk about some potential cooperation between China and the EU and also UK. I think at the current stage, the cooperation between both are very critical, not just for energy, but also for global climate governance. But I think now the better concept should be managed independence, because now, as we know, EU, UK, and China now depend more than before. But independence now means some risk at the same time. So what we should do is manage independence. The task is not to remove interdependence, it's not isolation, which is costly, unrealistic, and damaging to the global transitions. So I think the task is to make independence more transparent, reciprocal, resilient, and politically acceptable. So China, I think, shouldn't be just seen as a supplier of low-cost clean technologies. Europe shouldn't be seen as only a regulator or market. China and Europe can be co-builders of the next phase of climate governance. China brings scale manufacturing, infrastructure, and implementation capacity. Europe brings regulation, carbon market design, finance standards. So this is why the Iran crisis is not only an energy security warning, but I think it is also a governance warning. It tells us that the old fossil fuel energy system is fragile. It also tells us that the new energy system must be deliberately built. It needs grids, storage, standards, finance, carbon markets, critical mineral governance. Because I also just published a paper on critical mineral in Oxford Review of Economic Policy. Because from my point of view, sequence is very important. Because climate policy are always forward-looking, but now the investment rules, the trade rules supporting those climate policies are now untestable and unstable. So that's why I think now for example, the investment and the trade rules should be parallel with climate goals. I shouldn't say of course we should have climate ambition, but at the same time, we should also need to make those rules more transparent, parallel with climate policies. So for China, the strategic answer is not to choose between energy security and climate ambition. It is to fuse them together. Energy security pushed China to reduce dependence on vulnerable fossil fuel choke points. Climate interests push China to accelerate renewables, electrification, and carbon management. Industrial interests push China to decarbonize heavy industry without disindustrialization. So diplomatic interests push China to turn green capacity into legitimate international leadership through standards, finance, and cooperation. So for China and Europe and the UK, I think the next step is to make climate cooperation more concrete, more resilient, and more connected to strategic interests. As we know, like I think yesterday the EU just passed the Acceleration Industrial Act. So I think the EU also changing the course. So in the next phase, I think EU will also combine industrials with climate policies more closely. So in this direction, I think we require a new generation of cooperation on transitional security, industrial in resilience, climate finance, carbon markets, and also carbon management. So the key message here is this: resilience is not achieved through isolation, but through efficient governance. So China and the EU can whether China and EU can govern the independence wisely enough, I think it will be critical to determine the future climate governance. Okay, thank you. I stop here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hu. Thank you for giving us very valuable insights on the combination between energy security and energy transition and climate ambition, and also insights on future international cooperation. And thank you all for your valuable comments. And we now open the Q&A session. Please use the Q&A box to type your question. And I think we have already got one question from Aaron. Do diversification efforts in China away from Middle Eastern energy imports put a strain on clean tech imports from China to the Middle East?
Would you like me to take that one?
Yeah, okay, sure. Thank you.
I mean, and Professor Hu might have a view. I mean, my other panelists might have a view. I mean,
Go ahead, please.
my observation is that no. So if it doesn't have a negative impact, I think if anything, they're not directly correlated, right? It's not one for one. I think there's definitely been an effort from China to sort of balance the trade deficit with the Middle East, and that has been exports of a variety of goods. But it's sort of, as Professor Hu was just saying, the sort of the move towards an energy transition and accelerated deployment of renewables. I think it will vary by country and geography, but on the whole, that trend will continue. The availability of lower cost clean tech, of good sort of good quality and low cost clean tech, I think will just compel that move and continue it. Short term, you might have a financial strain in the Middle East. There will be an effort to rebuild, but those are sort of sovereign choices, right? And I think they will build their energy infrastructure for exports, but especially Saudi and the UAE have their own visions for 2030 and for their energy transitions, and therefore I think we'll still rely on Chinese technologies to power that.
Okay, probably I can add one more point. I think you already responded very good. But I think because now lots of people are talking about China's competitiveness in clean energy. So if China wants to be clean energy leadership, I think it can't just rely on the scale and the cost. So I think the high concentration of energy, clean energy industrial chains has created concerns in some countries over employment, supply chain security, and the industrial competitiveness. That's what I just mentioned. Now, interdependence sometimes becomes now more political sensitive and becomes like a weapon. So because in the last few months, because I stayed in EU for like some time, and I have lots of exchange with scholars from EU side. So I think that for the future, like cooperation, we shouldn't just focus on price and deployment. I think how can we make the win-win deal for both EU, China, also for the Middle East countries is very important. Also, the political acceptance is another important, factor we need to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. And Philip, do you want to add something? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your nice response. And we also have a second question from Wang Xiyu. Could you share insights about the involvement of China into the Middle East crisis and its Belt and Road strategy? Are the strategy and its implementation affected?
I'm a Belt and Road watcher, so I will pick this up.
Okay, sure.
I mean, the Middle East has been a major area for, as has already been mentioned, for renewable energy investment, maybe nuclear sales and other energy engagement, as well as a huge raft of other stuff. So this Middle East is one of the big areas for Belt and Road engagement on all fronts. Not least because most Middle East countries can actually pay for it. So that's actually very attractive. But as Mikhail has already alluded to, well, one, the current crisis stops all of that. As we emerge from it, depending on the amount of destruction in different Middle East countries, there may be a shortage of money to buy new stuff because they're going to have Qatar's going to have to rebuild its LNG export terminals. There've been pipelines to repair, oil fields to repair, new pipelines to build to export oil and gas, avoiding the Straits of Hormuz. So I think whilst the relationship between the Middle East and China will not necessarily deteriorate, I think the amount of cash to buy Chinese stuff that may be reduced as countries struggle to do more important and urgent things domestically. And of course, Iran, China's energy companies have been trying to invest in Iran for 20 years now. Let's see what sort of Iran appears out of the rubble.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the third question from Michelle. There seem to be increasing hostility towards China in many quarters in Europe, in part as a result of US and in part for internal reasons. Given the need to accelerate the energy transition following fossil market instability, would it not be in the interest of China and Europe to work more together instead? I think it's a question for Professor Hu.
Okay, yeah. Yes, because now that's why I mentioned in my speech how to balance low carbon transition and also competitiveness. So that's a task for UK and also for China work together. Because in one time after the Middle East crisis this time, both realize renewable energy will be the only choice for both of us. But at the same time, for example, I just came back from Munich. I visited the BMW factories because they facing lots of competition from China's EV car industries. So they have lots of unemployment now. I mean, the same for the BMW also in China's domestic market. Also, they face fierce competitions. So how to balance your economic interests and also your long-term goal of climate? So that's the real test. So I think, so that's why we need to have some innovation idea, how to make the win-win deal for both. Because China, for example, lots of people ask me about the overcapacity issues. Because from my research, I can tell you one story for the China EV batteries. As we know, in 2015, China's EV battery, the price still higher than the battery made produced in South Korea and Japan. Also, the quality is not as good as those two places. But only after 5 years, China's EV battery quality is the same, but with lower cost. What happens? From our investigation, two reasons I think played very important roles. First is China's central policy makings, because in China, as long as central government has a policy, and then every province will follow the suit. Each province will take its advantage of its endowments. For example, Inner Mongolia will produce like key minerals, and they will export those key minerals to like Jiangsu, Zhejiang province, which is have a high technology, which is good for like making EV car batteries and cars. So we have complete supply chain. But in EU, we have different systems. Although every country belongs to EU, but every country also have its own autonomy to making different decisions. So not like China, every province will follow the same. So that's why I make some policy very efficient. The second, I think the even important than the first is the learning by doing. Because at that time, as we know, each province have their own EV car industry. So each also will learn from each other. So from our estimates, from learning by doing, the cost of the EV battery reduced almost by 40%. So that's really make the China's EV battery very competitive in the world market. So that's why China is catching up. But at the same time, we also create the overcapacity issues because each province will produce the EV batteries. So that's the same for China. How can we balance in the next phase? Because right now we have too many EV like companies, like more than 100. So I think eventually China probably will have only 5 to 10 at the most. So China in domestically also facing the same issue. How can we reduce over competitiveness, right? So I think so that's not China's. I mean, due to that, why I want to mention this example, I mean, because China's different political system as EU. So that's why first you need to understand, but also we need to find common solutions to those problems. How can we solve together? So I think that's my response. We really need to balance this, and because yes, different countries really have different, political system, policy priorities. So how can we make this reconcile with each other and make the win-win deals? Will be a real test for EU, China, and the UK.
Can I just come in there? I think, Professor Hu, you forgot one thing, which is the national security concerns of European countries. I mean, just this week, they said there must be no EU funding going to Chinese inverters, okay? Because with various bits of electrical equipment, it's clear that there is some control back in the Chinese company. I don't want to get into this, but this is one of the obstacles, and Mikhail has written about this with respect to wind, is the whole security issue. Take that away, things become a lot easier.
I mean, if I could also add to that, I mean, there's from a climate, from an energy transition perspective, it's a no-brainer, right? The sort of the need or the ability to use available and good quality clean tech is sort of a very clear solution. The issue becomes when you add on the additional policy elements of industrial competitiveness, as Professor Hu was just saying. Europe is deindustrializing and cannot compete with China for a variety of reasons, and part of them are the difference in the system. There is the national security concern. There is the US element. We are today in a fundamentally different world than we were 10 years ago, where, globalization was there. You reduced the cost of everything. You shared the benefits. Today, those linkages, and I think in Europe, if governments cannot deliver on the energy transition on both employment and reducing bills, or at least they've promised to do that, then the energy transition, then the commitment to the energy transition will be undermined. And so there has to be a rebalancing of how do you, again, advance the energy transition, but protect industries. And it's very different in Europe, right? Some countries have an auto sector, some have a wind sector. But the sort of tale of solar as the industry that we lost is still very alive. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that national security concerns, industrial competitiveness must be taken into account in addition to energy transition, because today they are part of the debate. And so you cannot look at these things in silo. If we were looking at it purely from an energy transition perspective, very easy. But there are other factors today to consider, and though these trade-offs will be difficult, and I agree with Professor Hu, we're going to have to find creative solutions to overcome them. I think they are available, but we're going to have to put our heads together. And again, currently the climate is one of mistrust and concern, and we're going to have to work very, very hard to overcome that.
Yes, I agree, but I also want to add one more point. I think now building trust is very important because as we know, like after 2020's Ukraine-Russia crisis, I think that's a very important obstacle for China, EU, and UK work together. So in my past 2 years experience, because I spent almost like half a year in EU in different countries. So because I'm from Tsinghua University, so we have lots of cooperations with also institutions from UK like LSE, London School of Economics. We also Oxford, Cambridge. We also have working with science pool like TUM in from Germany. So from these discussions and exchange, I think we really intensify our understanding between each other. For example, that's why I wrote my article for China's critical mineral development strategy. I think so. It will be online very soon. So I also want to send to you. So because after I told the story in China, probably you will have more understanding about why this will happen in China. So sometimes it's like like energy national security is on purpose, but sometimes it's due to what I just mentioned. Political system is different. The market is different. So the tradition is different. So there's so many reasons. So that's why how to because at this stage, I mean, both of us, both you and China, really need to accelerate the transition. That's very important for our 100% energy security, right, in the long run. So if that's the case, as long as from as long as we have the common belief in climate science, we have the common belief like renewables will be our ultimate choice. I think we really can make something happen. So now is how to, I think now I want to use the structural cooperation. How can we do that? We really need to think about. So that's why now I'm cooperating with authors from Oxford, from LSE. I'm working with LSE on like just the transition. We compare in different regions what we can learn from each other. We know UK did good, also Germany did also good. We compared 10 countries. China is catching up because we're also facing the same problem in Inner Mongolia, in Shanxi province. So I think we have lots of lessons from. Actually, I think we can really learn from each other in so many aspects. That's my, I mean, personal experience in the past 2 years. So I'm confident we can still cooperate. I think we can find some solutions.
Okay, thank you all. And I think there is the last question. We can finish this last question, okay? Give a short response to Aaron and also about international relations. How do you see China's future role to navigate diplomatic efforts between Iran and the other GCC countries? Do you like to give a short comment?
I think Michal is the international relations person here.
That's a bit of a stretch, but
Michal?
I mean, I think just as China has done for the past sort of 20 odd years, where it has relations with pretty much each and every country in the Gulf and in the Middle East more broadly, I think that's precisely why it has been reluctant to take on a more sort of strategic, political, diplomatic role. I think it prefers, first of all, to engage in sort of more pragmatic transactional ties, sort of on exchanges, on investments, and on dealing sort of bilaterally with countries. I think a deeper role and a deeper involvement, we often envisage something a bit like the US is not very much in sort of China's DNA or habits but also fundamentally the Middle East is far from China. And despite all the linkages and imports and exports, it's not a core interest for China. And so I think China will be very wary of taking on a broader sort of leadership role, but it will remain very heavily invested and engaged in the Gulf region.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. I know that we are basically out of time, and I want to thank the panel for your insight for discussion, very productive in discussion, and thank IAE for the opportunity to host and to hear this. And I also would like to thank all the audience for your excellent questions and participation. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, and thank you, our distinguished panelists, for an outstanding webinar. The webinar will be available on IEE's website for future downloads. We thank you all for attending, and now I close officially this webinar. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.